Hi everyone. Let's continue talking about the French defense and learn how to play it as the black pieces. In our first video we looked at the advance French variation, and in our second video we looked at the exchange variation. So we're going to continue looking at another variation in this video, starting with this standard position where black is threatening the e4 pawn. So I think most lower rated players would play either the advanced French with e5 or the exchange variation taking on d5. When you get higher rated grandmasters, for example, they like to develop their pieces. They don't like to push pawns and exchange pawns as often as developing pieces. So what's the most natural thing to do when this pawn is under attack? Well, defend it with a developing move. And there are two moves that come to mind, knight to c3 and knight to d2. I suppose you could play bishop to d3. I think the reason not a lot of advanced players like to play this is because that bishop immediately will lose a tempo like this. Okay, and grandmasters like to preserve their bishops as well. So most common moves at the top levels are knight to c3 and knight to d2, and they both have their pros and cons. Knight to c3 might look more natural to people because it's developing to the normal square that knight goes to, where it can affect both of these central light squares. The reason somebody might not want to play this is because they would have to face this pin, and this is known as the winnower variation. And now that pawn is under attack again. It's a perfectly good way to play. There's nothing wrong with knight to c3. But if you're not prepared to face the winnower, or you don't want to face the winnower, you can try knight to d2 to defend that pawn. And not only does this make this move pointless because white can play c3, but also putting the knight on d2 keeps your c pawn mobile. It's not blocked. For example, you know from the advanced French video that the most common pawn break for black after these pawns get locked up is for black to play c5. And white would like to counter that by playing c3 to bolster his center, so that knight is not in the way. Now, of course, that knight is more passive on d2. It doesn't have any effect on the d5 square, for example. And for now, at least, it's temporarily blocking in the dark squared bishop. So there are pros and cons. Anyway, another interesting thing about this position is not a lot of top-level games go like this, but sometimes I like to do this as black. I can take on e4. That's a perfectly valid move, and white wants to recapture with the knight, which means if black is planning on taking on e4, then it doesn't really matter which of these two moves white has played. They both end up in the same place anyway. Well, we're not going to look at that taking move. We're going to look at something else here. And this move, knight to d2, begins the Tarrasch variation. So this is known as the Tarrasch variation, and we're going to explore it over more than one video. We'll just look at part of it today in this video. All right, I think the most common move in this position is c5 right away. But instead of c5, I'm going to try knight to f6 as recommended by Grandmaster Simon Williams, the Ginger GM. He says you're going to have a lot more fun if you play knight to f6 over c5. All right, so knight to f6 attacks the pawn again. White has to do something about it. The most natural reply here is to push it. It's a good time to push it. You get a tempo on the knight has to move again. And the square we're going to move it to is d7. Okay, so after knight goes from f to d7, then white needs to develop his pieces, and the most natural move here is bishop to d3, very strong diagonal for that bishop. If we ever castle kingside, then that bishop is already poised to attack, so that's the square for the bishop. And after that, we're going to make our primary pawn break here, c5. Okay, and when white sees c5, he automatically plays c3 because he wants to replace the pawn with another pawn should we take on d4. Okay, and now we're going to play knight to c6 to put further pressure on d4. So it's attacked twice. It's only defended once. So white has to do something about that. And again, what would a grandmaster do here? Well, grandmaster would develop a piece in order to defend d4. So it looks like it's time to move this other knight. And again, there's a question, which square does the knight go to defend d4? Well, again, both moves have different points to them. They're both good. I think the most natural one to me, the one I would play as white, is actually knight to e2, which looks more passive, putting it on the second rank rather than on the third rank. But ask yourself this question. When you're developing that knight, before you develop it, ask yourself, where's this knight going to go? It's not going to sit there on d2 forever. It can't block in that bishop forever, so it has to move somewhere. I suppose it can go over to b3, but I think white wants to start putting his pieces on the king side and start maybe an attack if black should castle over there. So the natural square for that knight is actually f3. So with that in mind, we put the other knight on e2 to keep that square free so that knight can go there. There's another point in this move knight to e2. We've already tried our primary pawn break. Do you remember what the secondary pawn break is in the French with this particular pawn structure? Yes, the secondary pawn break is f6, trying to hit the head of that pawn chain. If we play f6 here, then this pawn becomes weak, and the move knight to f4 can be powerful in this situation, attacking that weakened pawn on e6. So that's another reason to put the knight on e2 in case knight to f4 is called for. All right, we'll look at knight to f3 in the next video, but let's concentrate on knight to e2 in this one. Now, before I go any further into this, I want to mention some different transpositional possibilities. If we back up, for example, in this position, after we play knight to f6, white may not push his pawn to e5 right away and hit our knight. There's another move that addresses the attack on e4, which is very natural, just bishop to d3, just defending it. Well, in that case, we're going to continue on with the same plan, our primary pawn break. We can expect c3 as a response, or we can expect white to play e5 now, either way. For example, if he plays e5 now, then we drop the knight back, then he plays c3, then we play knight c6, knight e2, and we've transposed back to that same position. So there are different ways to get to this position. White may not always make the same move order. Another possibility is after e5, knight f d7, you may not see bishop to d3 here. You might see c3 right away instead. Well, that's okay. We just continue with our plan, c5, then probably bishop d3. Now, if white does intend to develop this knight on e2, then of course he has to get this bishop out of the way first. So it's time to play bishop d3 now. Okay. If white intends to put the knight on f3 instead, then I suppose he could do that now and play bishop to d3 after. But let's take a look at bishop d3 here. Well, then knight c6 is our plan, knight e2, and again we've transposed to this same position. Okay, so let's stick with this move knight to e2 and analyze it. So what do we want to do here? Well, we want to eventually make our secondary pawn break f6. Since white has this point under control, he's got it defended twice with the c3 pawn and the e2 knight, and he can move the other knight to f3 at any moment and defend it again. So we'd like to push to f6. Turns out not to be a good move here. After f6, white has the excellent move knight f4, as we discussed before. We've got that weakness on e6, and so he's targeting it. Not only is he threatening that pawn, but he's also threatening queen to h4 check. That would be quite annoying because blocking it with the g-pawn results in a familiar tactic. Knight takes g6 would be devastating. So we don't want to face that. So instead of playing that secondary pawn break, we prepare it with a very clever idea. We exchange pawns on d4 first. We can expect him to recapture with the c pawn. That's what the pawn was doing there. That's why it's there. Then we play this pawn break f6. Now why is that? Well, if he tries knight f4 here, which is not the most popular move, then we can play knight takes d4 to address that. That's why we exchanged pawns, because now he doesn't have a c3 pawn anymore, and that allows us to put this knight on d4. And that is protecting this point on e6. Here's a typical line. You can play like this, but here's what would happen. White can try queen h5 check. And what we would do is actually move the king up. Okay, there's no better move here in this position, so we move the king up. Then white can take on f6. We'll take back with the knight, hitting the queen. White can win an exchange here. Do you see how? Yeah, knight to g6 check. And we're going to take the knight, and white's going to get our queen. And now we're going to slide our king over to f7 just to bolster these pawns. It's a nice safe square for now, getting out of the way of the dark squared bishop. We can push to e5 soon. We can get the light squared bishop out to f5. And black actually has good compensation for the exchange that white has won. He's got a very strong center here and a great knight on d4 that cannot be driven away by a pawn. So this is how black can prepare for that move, knight to f4. So just to recap that, in this position, we don't want to play this first because then we don't have a great response to knight to f4. But we exchange rather on d4 first. Then we play f6, and now we do have a good response to knight to f4. We take on d4, protecting the e6 point. So that's the point of our play. But knight to f4 is not the most popular move. Turns out e takes f6 is. But before we look at that main line move, there's another move that I think lower rated players would consider playing here, which is f4. Seems pretty good supporting your center even further. You've got a really strong point now on e5. But it turns out not to be great. And here's what we do about it. We take on e5, and now it turns out either recapture weakens white's position. For example, if you take back with the d pawn, then you've just given up your central strong point on d4. This pawn is now mobile, and this square is available for either the knight or the dark squared bishop. You could try bishop to c5 here and try to keep white from castling, or you can try what the engine prefers, knight to c5, hitting the light squared bishop. But either way, you've just gained a nice square for your pieces, and you've just made, or white has just voluntarily given up his strong pawn on d4. So I don't think that's the best way to play with that f4 move. Oh, and if you take with the other pawn, the f pawn, then you drop, you kind of lose your whole center here to a simple tactic. We take on d4, and we're threatening the e5 pawn, so white's center is falling apart. And if he decides to take our knight, we get it back. Do you see how we get the knight back? Yeah, we have this fork right here. He blocks, we can take the knight back. Okay, and we're doing great in this position. The e5 pawn is going to fall as well. So f4 is not really a great response to this pawn break. The best move here for white, the main line move, is to take on f6. And now we actually see one of the purposes of this move f6. Not only are we trying to strike at white's strong center, which you always have to do in the French defense. You can't just let that center stand there and cramp you. White has more space. But we're also trying to get this knight back into the game. Remember that knight was sidelined over to d7 by this pawn push, and we want to get it back into the game, and we want it over on the king side, in fact. So after f6, we anticipate this capture, and then we capture back with the knight, and the knight is back in the game. So let's look at this position. Well, I think black is doing pretty well, even though he has a major defect in his pawn structure. He has this backward pawn here, which can later be attacked down the e-file. And the square in front of it is a weak square. It's a hole in our position. White might want to put a piece there, a minor piece, like a knight later. Okay, but we're going to get very active development with our pieces. And when we have this kind of structural weakness, we do want to play energetically. We want to attack. We don't want to just sit back, play passively, and let white play against our weakness. So here's our plan. We're going to put this bishop on d6, natural square for that. We'll put the queen on c7, make a nice battery here. We'll castle kingside. We'll have a nice open file for our rook. And we'll get our light squared bishop into the game through a pretty normal route in many variations of the French defense. You can bring it to d7 and then later to e8, and then it can come out on this diagonal, maybe even to h5 or g6. Okay, so that's our plan with our pieces. If we can enact that, that would be ideal. All right, so let's see what a typical line of play is here. White wants to probably develop his knight here and open up the diagonal for the dark square bishop. Get ready to castle. Okay, and we're going to play bishop d6, so we can castle. If white castles, we will play queen to c7. We're going to delay castling by a move, and the reason for that is we're going to stop this move bishop to f4 in this position. If we castle here, then white can play bishop f4. Now, why does white want to play that? Well, he would be very happy to exchange the dark squared bishops. This dark squared bishop is our better bishop. It's not blocked in by the central pawns. Our central pawn here is on a light square. That makes our light squared bishop the worst of the two bishops. And this is white's worst bishop because of his central pawn. So he would like to exchange his bad bishop for our good bishop. And this is a very good bishop aiming right at the h2 square. So if white castles in this position, we're going to delay castling by a move and play queen to c7 to make this battery. So bishop to f4 is impossible. And so most players here would play bishop g5 instead to get that piece developed. Okay, we'll castle, and then a common idea is to voluntarily drop that bishop back. And the reason is it wants to go all the way to the g3 square so that it can, again, challenge our dark squared bishop. So it doesn't want us to continue to have control of this diagonal. Well, we have a very interesting, very good move in this position, which is the move knight to h5. There's two purposes of that move. One is if white does drop his bishop back to g3, then we'll take with the knight and we'll preserve our dark squared bishop. But there's another purpose of this move. It gets out of the way of our rook. So we have a possibility of an exchange sacrifice here on f3, ruining the pawn structure in front of the white king and maybe even taking on h7, getting a pawn in return and attacking. That's a strong idea in this variation. Let's see what happens if white retreats the bishop, though. Well, in that case, we do take it with the knight. We can expect h takes g3. And now we'll just look at one more move here. I don't think it's a strong idea in this line to initiate this exchange sacrifice because this pawn is bolstering the g3 pawn here. But an interesting idea, I think a good move here is g6. And that not only kind of blunts this diagonal, this queen may be coming to c2, but the idea of this move is to gain the g7 square for our queen. That would be a nice square to put the queen on. The queen-bishop battery isn't doing much here anymore. So putting the queen here can pressure the d4 point, and the queen can make a good defender on our king side. So that's our idea. Okay, so that's one possible line of play. So let's look at a couple Grandmaster games. I'm going to look at a game here. John Ems has the white pieces and Simon Williams has the black pieces. Simon Williams is the GM that taught me all the ideas in the French. It's the guy I'm learning all this from. So this game was played in 1999, and John Ems opened with e4. They played the French. Knight d2 is the Tarrasch variation or Tarrasch variation. Okay, Simon Williams likes this. Knight f6, e5, knight d7, bishop d3, just as we discussed. Simon Williams makes the primary pawn break, c3 defends, knight c6 pressuring d4 further, and now this move knight e2. Do you remember the purpose of this move? The difference between that and knight to f3? Yeah, one of the main purposes of this move knight e2 is to keep the f3 square available for the other knight. Also, this knight sometimes wants to go to f4. Okay, so black exchanged on d4 before playing the secondary pawn break. Do you remember the purpose of that? Yeah, if you exchange first, you get rid of that c pawn, and then you play this secondary pawn break, you're making the d4 square available for your knight in case white goes knight to f4, attacking the e6 pawn. Okay, so they exchanged pawns on d4, and then Williams played f6. Okay, e takes f6 is the main line. The knight takes back, so now the knight is back into the game, and black's going to get some good development for his pieces. Knight f3, bishop d6, white castles, and queen c7. Do you remember why black delays castling for a move there? Yeah, black is trying to create this battery to stop white from easily exchanging his bad bishop. So bishop g5, castle, bishop h4, knight h5, just as we discussed, two purposes here: to take on g3 if the bishop retreats, and also to open up the possibility of rook takes f3. So here we'll deviate, the game deviates from the theory we just looked at, and Ems played queen c2, so he didn't drop the bishop back to g3. So this is a threat on the h7 pawn, and so black defends by playing h6. You don't want to play g6 here because there's this strong sacrifice here. So black played h6. Okay, white tried checking and then putting the bishop on g6, attacking the knight. Well, in this position, I think it is appropriate to do what the ginger GM did. He sacked the exchange here on f3. G takes f3, bishop takes a h2 check. There are two moves white can make here. White tried king h1. Let's take a quick look at king g2 and see what the difference is. After king to g2, black wants to save his knight. He's got a couple squares he could move it to. Putting the king on g2 does allow for black to get in this check here. Now, I'll point out that it's actually a blunder to drop it back to f6, and that's because of this sequence. Bishop takes f6. Okay, that forces us to recapture with the g-pawn, and now our pawn cover is totally broken here. And white can play rook h1. And now the bishop is under attack, and once it moves, this pawn's going to fall, and looks like black's going to get mated eventually. So we don't want to put that knight back on f6. We put it on f4 with a check. And now white doesn't want to take that bishop here and give us this discovered check with the queen, and we can take that bishop next. So I think white would try knight takes f4, queen takes f4, bishop g3, forcing us to exchange the bishops. Maybe queen f6 to put more pressure on d4 here. Bishop d3, queen takes d4, rook a d1. So this is the line given by the engine. And I think black has sufficient compensation for the exchange. He has two pawns anyway. So that's fine. Okay, so that's what could happen if white played king g2, but John M's played king h1. Okay, now black plays knight f4. Okay, very strong move. Again, the idea is if white takes the bishop, then there's this discovered check, and then black can get both of these bishops here. Okay, white tried knight g3, and now you have to ask yourself this question. How did this bishop get here? It looks like it just teleported to h2. Very strange. If you just gave this position to your friend, they would think it was composed rather than played in a grandmaster game. Okay, queen d6 is a very subtle move, very clever move by the Ginger GM. We saw in this last position, white didn't really want to take that bishop because of a discovered check. But then he puts his knight here, so there will be no more discovered checks, and now he really is threatening to take the bishop. This move, queen d6, believe it or not, is designed to save his bishop, at least for another day. Okay, that bishop should not be taken now. If he does take it, which John M's did not do, that's a blunder. And here's why. It's because of knight takes d4, attacking the queen, and that's the purpose of this little tiny queen move here, was to get that knight unpinned. That knight is currently pinned. And so if white were to take this bishop on h2, then black can take on d4 and attack this queen. And this queen is trying to defend this bishop. It's defending that bishop at the moment. But there's nowhere it can go along that diagonal safely to defend it. So it'd have to drop back somewhere, maybe d1. Then black can take here. And white looks like he's getting the knight back. And if you look at the material, black is down a whole rook. But the Ginger GM must have seen this entire line. He would have played e5. That queen is now defending the other bishop, and black's trying to break that defensive connection. The only place the queen can go to keep in contact with the bishop is on a4, but then black would have played bishop d7, and now the queen can no longer defend the dark square bishop. After it moves somewhere, black would take it, and now black is only down the exchange, and he has a couple pawns for it. So black is doing fine, and he's got this great center pawn duo here. So that's why king takes h2 would have been a blunder, and that's why queen to d6 is a very clever way to preserve that bishop a little bit longer. So white tried rook a d1 to defend this pawn that black just attacked after he unpinned his queen. Very complicated game here. We won't go through all the lines. It would take too long. Black tries e5, pressuring d4 further. Bishop f5. The bishops get exchanged. Rook f8 hits the queen. Queen g4. Bishop takes g3. Finally, this bishop does something. All that time, white was not taking that bishop. Bishop takes g3. F takes back. Okay, the knight has to move. It drops back to e6. So there's a lot of pressure on d4 now, so white has to take. Okay, black takes back with the knight. Queen is hit. It moves over to h5. Black starts pushing his past central pawn. Bishop e7. Okay, so this is forking the major pieces here, so black has no choice. He has to give up his knight for the bishop, like that. Okay, then queen d7 supports the pawn. g4, the pawn pushes, and strangely, the players agreed to a draw in this position. I don't know why they did. It's not a dead draw. The engine says the score is about plus 0.4, slight edge for white, but black certainly has some compensation for the loss of the exchange. And let's look at one last Grandmaster game. So this game was played between Michael Adams with the white pieces and Alexei Shirov with the black pieces. So this is another Tarrasch with knight d2. Okay, remember the Tarrasch is designed to avoid this pin and to keep the c-pawn mobile. Maybe also to get that, to get that knight over to the f3 square, to the king side quicker. Okay, so knight d2, knight f6, e5, knight falls back. White decides to preemptively protect on d4, get this pawn break, then bishop t3, knight c6, and now the move that introduces us to this variation, knight e2. This is the move we're talking about in this video. Okay, so again, black would like to play this, but before he does that, do you remember what he's supposed to do? Yeah, he's supposed to trade pawns on d4 first and then play f6. Purpose is if white plays knight f4, then black can take on d4 and protect e6. All right, so e takes f6 is the best move. Again, we're looking at the same line. Knight takes f6, knight f3, bishop d6, castles. And just like the Ginger GM, Alexei Shirov goes for queen to c7 to make this battery to stop the bishop from coming to f4. But now we'll see a new move. Okay, Michael Adams tries g3. So the purpose of that move is to put the bishop on f4 anyway, defended by the pawn. There's nothing we can really do about the exchange of the dark square bishops. If white wants to exchange them, he's going to exchange them. So black castled, then the bishop comes to f4. Okay, black just develops. Rook c1, pinning the knight, putting pressure on our queen. Okay, knight e4, centralizing the knight, opening up the f-file. White decides to now exchange the dark square bishops. Plays knight c3 to challenge our knight on e4. Okay, we exchange. I like this pawn structure. We had this weak backward pawn on the e-file, and now white has one on the c-file. Okay, black decides to get rid of his weak pawn right away. He pushes it. Knight takes, d takes, queen takes. So now both players have an isolated pawn, same material. It's pretty drawish. So I think black's opening was a success in this line with g3. Okay, so white was trying to trade off bad bishop for good bishop, but what ended up happening was everything got traded off. Rook e1 hits the queen, it drops back to f6, queen d2, rook a d8, bishop f1, bishop c6, very solid, bishop g2. Okay, black pushes the d-pawn, gets rid of his weakness and white's weakness. Bishops get exchanged. The pawns on d4 get exchanged. Queen moves aside. And we have a very, very drawish looking endgame. Yes, black has, I think, one more weak pawn than white does over here, but it's still a pretty easy draw for black. So I won't show you the rest of the game, a little boring. Black did end up holding it. It was a draw. This is move 26. The game was drawn in 50 moves. All right, so I hope that gives you a feel for part of the Tarrasch variation of the French. And we're going to look at more of the Tarrasch in future installments in this series. Thanks for watching.